Do you actually need a publisher for your game in 2025? Would I ever work with a publisher again? And speaking of which, what is a publisher anyways? Well, the first thing to understand is that every publisher is different. The term publisher can really mean anything. Generally speaking though, it's going to be some combination of funding and services in exchange for a portion of your game's revenue. Now I did work with a publisher for my first game, Farewell North. Out of respect for them and the other devs they work with, I'm not going to get into specifics of our arrangement. This is not a review of my publisher, this is just how I'm thinking about publishers going forward. I see a lot of devs looking at publishers as this goal to achieve, something that's going to make your game successful, but that's not really the case. And honestly, I don't really see anyone thinking about publishers the way I feel you ought to. So the most common element of any kind of publisher deal is going to be funding. Publishers can fund your game, but it's very important to understand why you would actually want this beyond, woo, money! Every financial investment, and making a game is a financial investment, is a balance of risk and reward. For example, depending on the country, government bonds are widely considered to be the safest investment. They only fail if the government fails, in which case you kind of have bigger problems. Savings accounts, slightly riskier, but generally considered pretty safe, and on and on. Specific funds, properties, stocks, these can really sit anywhere on the chart, but generally speaking, you might graph their risk profile, something like this. The trouble with the term reward is that it kind of implies a guarantee, so I prefer the term potential. The point is that the higher the risk, the higher the potential reward should be to compensate you for taking that risk. Think about it, right? Why would you invest in a risky stock if you thought it had less potential than a savings account? So what does this have to do with publishers? Bear with me a moment, I promise you I do have a point. So if games are an investment, that means we can chart them on this graph. Theoretically, games have infinite potential. You could make a game that outsells Minecraft, which has done $3 billion in revenue, but we can come up with a more realistic approximation of your game's potential looking at market data of similar games that have been recently released. And as we've learned over the last few years with all the studio closures and layoffs, games have plenty of risk. Basically, the risk with your game is going to boil down to whether you can make the game, how much it's going to cost to make the game, and whether anyone wants to buy the game. Now, risk is synonymous with uncertainty, which means that we can reduce risk by proving certain factors. For example, being further through development proves that you can actually make the game, which reduces the risk of the project. Similarly, we can prove that there's a market for the game through social media and wish lists, again, further reducing the risk. We can never reduce the risk to zero, there's always going to be some inherent risk in the project, but we can reasonably assume that a game that's a month from release with 1 million wish lists and a ton of hype is less risky than, say, your car salesman cousin's VR MMO project that he pitched you over Facebook Messenger. So again, what does this have to do with publishers? Well, believe it or not, if we can actually reduce some of the risk and demonstrate some of the potential, we can make the case that this game is a good investment, and we can sell some of that potential and reduce our personal risk to someone else, a publisher. Publishers are set up in a way where they can theoretically absorb a lot more risk than your average cash-strapped indie developer. If you had $10,000 in savings, you quit your job, and you went all in on this one game idea, if it flops, you're f***ed. But a publisher might have $1 million to invest in 10 games, and if a few of those flop, it can hopefully absorb those losses through the success of the others, assuming that they're a good publisher and they're making good decisions. This is why the publisher funding isn't the same as a loan that has to be paid back win or lose. You're actually selling the publisher something, which is the potential of your project, in order to reduce your risk. The more the potential and the less risk, the more you can sell it for. And the question is, do you actually need to do that? The thing is, you're going to have to remove a lot of risk and demonstrate a lot of potential before you can get a good publisher deal anyway. So if you get to a point where publishers are throwing money at you, you might not need to de-risk anymore. What if it's not so much about risk, it's that you flat out cannot afford to make the game? Well, I would argue that that's still a risk to the project, and there are several ways that you could solve this. You could look at crowdfunding and grants, both of which will ultimately be quite a bit cheaper than a publisher if you're successful. Keep in mind though, even crowdfunding has risks. If you run a failed crowdfunding campaign, and then you need to turn to a publisher to fund your project, guess what? You've just removed a lot of uncertainty from your project in exactly the wrong way, proving that there's no potential. No publisher is going to jump at that opportunity. There's no one-size-fits-all to funding your game. It really depends on your specific situation, how risky your game is, and how much risk you can afford to take on. But that's how I would suggest thinking about it. Publisher funding is one of many tools to de-risk your project in exchange for some of its potential. So far though, what I've really been describing isn't a publisher at all, it's an investor. The key difference is that a publisher doesn't just provide funding, they also offer services to you and your game. This could be porting, advertising, QA, localization, community management, even hands-on development. Literally anything is on the table. Again, publishers are all unique, it's a very broad term, and they all offer different services depending on what you need. But it's very important to realize that you can get all of these elsewhere, or you can do them yourself. And you're going to pay a pretty large premium to have a publisher do it for you, especially on the back end as they recoup these costs. The only reason you would want a publisher to do this is, again, de-risking. The publisher will take on the risk of paying for these services or doing them themselves in exchange for more of your project's potential. The question is, do you want to do that? Probably not. But again, it depends on your project, how risky it is, and how much risk you can afford to take. Before signing with my publisher for Farewell North, I was actually very much against the idea of working with a publisher. I believed in the game and I approved that there was a market for it through YouTube and other channels, and I had a job that paid well. I could afford to hold on to that risk and all of that potential myself. But I always took the call when a publisher reached out. You can learn a lot through those conversations. It turned out that my publisher's offer just made a lot of sense, but I still wanted to hold on to as much of the potential as possible, so I took on a lot of the risk. I hired my own contractors and I did my own console ports in order to hold on to as much of the potential as I possibly could. Whenever it's reasonable to do so, I always prefer to do things myself or with my own teammates because it allows me to leverage the skills and experience in my future projects, and I can amortize that initial investment over multiple games. What I mean by that is, if you have your publisher do console ports, let's say, you're going to pay them for that service out of your game's potential, and when you go on to your next project, you're going to pay someone else to do those console ports out of that game's potential, and on and on. You're paying for the same service over and over and over again. If, on the other hand, you do it yourself, then you build and retain the tools and knowledge to do it next time, making it cheaper and easier each time you do it. Skills like marketing, QA, community management, these are all things that you should be doing anyways, and that experience will carry over to all your future projects. You should definitely offload things when it makes sense to do so. I'm just suggesting that you look into hiring your own contractors rather than going with a publisher if you can handle that risk. Even better if you can do some of these things yourself and avoid having to bring on additional help at all, and a great way to do that is through the sponsor of today's video, Skillshare. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives with thousands of classes led by industry experts. When you're making a game, there's so much to learn, and Skillshare provides classes across game design, animation, illustration, marketing, and so much more. When you get started, you'll be asked about your interests, and from there, Skillshare immediately surfaces recommendations tailored to your goals. I recommend diving into their learning paths, which are a great way to pick up all the skills you need to take your game or your business to the next level. While making Farewell North, it really became clear just how important marketing would be if I wanted to stand a chance at earning a living making games. Just like writing code or 3D modeling, marketing is a skill that you can learn and improve on with the help of Skillshare. So I've been honing my skills in the digital marketing for companies learning path to learn how to optimize my marketing efforts so I can spend more time focused on making great games. To de-risk my future projects, I've been enjoying classes like Learn the Fundamentals of Game Design by making a board game in one day, which taught me how to prototype a game's design as a board game, but letting me validate the idea as early as possible. Thank you so much to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so you can start learning shaders, game development, marketing, or dive into something totally new, so make sure you check the description and follow the link to get started today. If you decide that a publisher is the right way to go for your project, there are 2 more things that you should be looking for in a potential partner. There's a lot that goes into releasing a game that might not be obvious, especially across multiple platforms, so having a team to guide you through that with their experience is very valuable. You have to make sure they have the right experience though. Don't partner with a mobile publisher if your goals are PC and console. The markets are entirely different and their experience won't help you. During contract negotiations, push as hard as possible to make sure that you have access to all the different backends and everything that they're doing, so you can learn from that experience and carry that forward to your future projects without needing a publisher again. This is quite rare, but certain publishers might have access to exclusive events, promotions, new consoles, stuff like that, which you won't be able to get on your own. If a publisher is offering these things, it could potentially be worth the partnership on their own, but you need to make sure they can actually open those doors and that it's the right thing for your game. But whether it's opening doors or doing QA, you need to make sure that literally every single thing your potential partner is offering, every wonderful promise that they're making, is detailed in full in the contract. Not just QA, but details. What are they actually doing? What are the tasks they'll be doing? You want schedules, budgets, task lists, all of that needs to be documented in the contract. What happens if they can't get that exclusive door opened for you? What do they mean by marketing? You can be very sure that what you're paying the publisher in terms of the rev share is going to be very thoroughly detailed in the contract, so make sure that their end of the bargain is as well. Now, you need a lawyer for this. Full stop. No excuses. If you think that you don't need a lawyer, give your head a shake. Take your time, find a lawyer that has indie game publisher contract experience. They do exist. If a publisher ever suggests that you don't need a lawyer, that you should speed this step up, or they're putting pressure on you to get the contract signed, turn around and run away. Do not look back. This is not a publisher you should be working with. When it comes to the revenue share, which is the potential that you're giving to the publisher and how they're going to earn their money, you need to be very careful the way that that's structured, as you might have wildly conflicting interests. If it's a simple percentage share and there's no terms around recoup, then it's pretty straightforward. The more the game sells, the more you both benefit. Your interests are aligned. You just need to decide if you can live with the percentage that they're taking. You do still have risks though, and a good lawyer will look out for these, but make sure that the percentage is based on net revenue, not gross revenue, and make sure that net revenue is very clearly defined. And make sure that what they're meant to be spending is a minimum spend, so they can't back away if they lose faith in the project. But let's be very careful here. This only applies if there are no terms around recoup. If there are terms around recoup, you may actually want that to be a maximum spend. Here's why. Let's say instead of a flat rate, there's actually a tiered structure around the recoup. For an easy example, let's say your publisher takes 100% of revenue until they've recouped their expenses. This is their break-even point. Beyond that, they take 50% of revenue until they double their expenses, and then they take 25% of revenue in perpetuity beyond that. In principle, this seems fair. They get paid back for the money that they spent, they earn a nice profit for that risk removal that they offered you, and then they back away and let the developer profit from their work. That seems fair, but there's actually a huge problem here. Let's say you release your game and it earns $250,000. If your publisher spent $25,000, then the first $25,000 of revenue goes to the publisher. At this point, the publisher's recouped their $25,000, the dev has earned nothing, and there's $225,000 of revenue left. Then they take 50% until they've earned a total of $50,000. The dev has received $25,000, and there's still $175,000 remaining. Finally, they take 25% on their remaining $175,000, so in the end, the publisher has earned a profit of $68,750. Okay, cool. Now let's see what happens if your publisher spent $50,000. So the publisher will again take 100% until they recoup that $50,000. In stage 2, they take 50% until they've reached a total of $100,000. Finally, in the last stage, they'll take 25% of the remainder, and in this scenario, the publisher ends up with a profit of $75,000. Whoops. The publisher spent way more money, and they've earned more profit than if they'd only spent $25,000, and you've earned far less. This structure allows and possibly even benefits our publisher to recklessly overspend, as long as they don't drastically overestimate the revenue of the game. Even worse, they could even potentially spend money after the release of the game, knowing how much is going to be recoupable. And that's the critical conflict of interest. The publisher needs to spend money, you need to avoid spending money. This doesn't make the publisher evil, it doesn't even make this a bad rate structure. You can put guardrails on this so you get to approve all spending, or there's a maximum that they can spend. If your game is a wild success, you may even end up doing most of the revenue share at that lowest percentage, benefiting you and allowing you to earn more money than a straight revenue share. But fundamentally, it does introduce a serious conflict of interest, and it's something that you need to be aware of. There are many ways that the revenue share can be structured. The point is that you need to analyze it and really understand where the incentives lie in the structure that you're looking at. Even the term revenue needs to be very clearly thought through and defined in the contract, because it can be bent and twisted in many different ways. There's a lot that changes when you work with a publisher, not just financials. You always sacrifice some independence, even if your contract says that you retain full creative control. You're going from being independent to having people to answer to. You're going to have milestones with deadlines, and if there's any doubt about the nature of your relationship, understand that platforms are going to send money to your publisher first before any of it goes to you. You're no longer really independent, you have stakeholders. This has all been quite negative, but there are benefits to having a publisher. Opening doors and bringing experience to the project are a huge help if you have the right partner, and de-risking the project might let you sleep better at night and potentially keep your indie game dream alive if your game doesn't necessarily outperform on release. But no publisher, not even Devolver, can guarantee that your project succeeds. Some publishers will definitely help, others will just drain your bank account, and you're going to pay a lot of money to figure out which your publisher is. A good lawyer and a good contract can help, but that's still a big risk to take, especially when the whole point of a publisher is to de-risk the project. And there's usually other options. I chose to work with a publisher for my game Feral North, and I learned a ton about releasing games through that process. But this is how I'll be thinking about publishers going forward. Ultimately, I'll probably always take the meeting because every publisher is different and you can learn a lot just talking to publishers. But it really comes down to de-risking the project. So unless I make a game that's so risky that I cannot take that risk on myself, or they can open some door that I just couldn't possibly open myself, I'll probably be happy to go it alone from here on out. Thank you so much to my patrons who vote on all these video topics, and a special thank you to my Magpies and my Osprey supporters Elegon, Purple Sloth Studio, Jason Hansen, Ellie Swaley, Raven Painted, and Justice Lind. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.